One of the things that annoys a lot of MMA fans is they'll be watching a UFC press conference and a media member will just ask a very stupid question. And I have a theory on why that happens, and that's what I'm going to discuss in today's video. My name is James Lynch. So Full Mount MMA did a really good video a couple of years ago, just compiling all the worst questions asked by media members. So I'm going to show you a question or two here to give you an example of what I'm talking about bad media questions. So we're going to get into that right here.
Brought up a very unlikely factor.
How's the actual journey over here, considering how icy it is and how cold it is? Has it basically, giving you a new perspective on this thing?
Just awful question. Asking a fighter about the weather and is that having an effect on the fighter? Like, I think they were talking about London here. I don't even know, but this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like every now and then you'll get a question and you're like, why would someone ask that? Like, you've got approved by the UFC to cover this event. How are you coming up with a question like this? And I think it's important to talk about the credential process of how the UFC does allow media members to cover their events. And I've talked about this in another video. I have it right here. How to cover UFC events as media. You can go check it out. It's very informative because I don't think a lot of people know how the process works, but you basically go to this access page and you have to submit to see if you get approved for a profile. And then once you get approved for a profile, then you can start applying for events. And even then you might not necessarily get approved for covering a UFC card. But how the UFC does their events is basically this way. They basically look at the outlet more importantly than anything. And what a good outlet would be, or an outlet that would get approved by the UFC, would be like a major outlet. So let's say you work for a TV station. Doesn't matter what TV station. It could be like a local TV station. It could be like a big TV station like CBS or Fox or ESPN or something like that. That's what they look for first. I think that's how the UFC does prioritize as far as who's going to get let in to cover events. It's the company you work for. It's not the individual. And that's a key thing here, because I'm going to explain why you get some questions asked at press conferences that are not so great. But I think this is actually a good way for the UFC to sort of filter out some of the fans, because here's what could happen. Let's say you make a YouTube channel or you make a website and you haven't been doing this very long. You don't want the UFC approving that person because they don't have a lot of experience. They might go in here and basically embarrass themselves or embarrass the company that they let someone in to cover an event that really has no experience. So this is why they prioritize the outlet, which I can kind of understand, but it's a double-edged sword, because while you may have a major outlet covering an event for you, you might have someone covering a UFC event that has no idea about the UFC. So every now and then you'll get someone asking like a really general question, like, how do you feel going into this fight, or something along those lines? Like, just really simple stuff where you're like, how do you think they feel? They probably feel great. They're not going to tell you they're feeling like crap. That's not typically how it goes. So that's one sort of downside to it, is that you may have people working for a big outlet, but they don't exactly know the sport that well, or they don't know how to ask really good specific questions. So you have that side of it. The other side of it as well is that they will also consider universities for some reason. If you work for a university and you work for like a radio station or a TV station at a university, they will approve you. The downside of that is you might have someone who has no experience, like I just referenced there, and they might be asking questions. Now that isn't too typical. Like I haven't seen too many university students ask a question and it kind of like ruin the press conference, but every now and then you will get people sort of doing that. This in a way is bad though, because what you will have is you will have really big YouTube channels or people that actually follow the sport and know the sport really well that are getting denied, that can't get UFC credentials. I've heard it happen time and time again with websites that most of us know where they can't get UFC credentials. So that's the issue, because you have people who know the sport and could ask good questions, but then you have people and they're not getting approved, but then you have people that, like I said, work for a bigger outlet and they're sort of more approved. Now, there's an exception to this rule. I'll give you a quick example. Kevin Iole, who used to work for Yahoo Sports, John Morgan, who used to work for the Underground and MMA Junkie, they still get credentialed to UFC events despite not working for a major outlet right now, but that's because they're veterans in the industry. But even then, the UFC knows, like, hey, they're going to ask good questions, but that's not typical. Like I said, it's more so based on the outlet you represent. Like for me, when I go cover UFC 300 tomorrow at the time I'm recording this, I go under Sportskeeda. They're a huge website in India. I do some interviews for them every month. So that's how I'm able to go cover events. It's not based off my YouTube channel or any of the other stuff that I do. It's based off working for them. And I think there's a few other outlets I could get approved for as well. But like I said, I explained this a little bit more in depth on the UFC credentials video that I did as well. So like I mentioned, it's a bit of a double-edged sword because like I said, you're having people that might not know the sport that well asking questions. And then you're also filtering out people that know the sport very well, because they could be covering, like you could be doing MMA content every single day and you know the sport really well. You would ask better questions than someone, say, working for a big outlet that doesn't follow the sport very well, because they'll sort of, again, they base it more off outlet, which is very, very interesting. an example, I'm not going to mention the outlet, but and I don't have it up here, but like I remember last year when I was covering, I think it was UFC 290, we had this guy from a major outlet that was obviously part of their betting side of things. And he kept asking the fighters, would you bet on yourself? Like, that's a stupid question. But again, no one's like telling the media how to like what type of questions to ask, as they shouldn't, because it's the media member's job to like know what they're doing. But that's where you'll get questions like that slip through the cracks, because you have people that, I mean, from his perspective, he's thinking, okay, I got to get betting content. I got to get stuff related to betting, but there's better betting questions to ask. You could ask a fighter who's never been knocked out, hey, do you think it's worth it to, well, actually, no, you shouldn't even ask fighters in general about like betting questions. I think there's better questions to ask that you could kind of bring up that are related to the fight, not necessarily for betting. Like, you know, you could say a fighter, for example, has never been finished. Maybe is it worth to, you know, bet a, you know, inside the distance prop or something like that? Or, you know, we might get good money on that is kind of what I'm getting at. So yeah, that's something as well that I think is, you know, you see every now and then is people asking questions like that, because again, it's not like, and by the way, that person who asked that question about to the fighter, oh, would you bet on yourself? It's not like the UFC's contacting the outlet after and saying, hey, why did you ask that question? They'll only do that if they're causing a stir. Like maybe they're asking about fighter pay, or they're really going hard on a fighter, and like kind of like I've seen very rare cases where something like that has happened. I remember a couple of years ago for the Aldo and Conor press conference, someone asked Aldo about fight pay, and Dana White kind of shut them down right away. And I know that PR guy did go to the outlet and kind of complain about that. But yeah, in general, like people just want like regular fight questions, or questions that are at least relevant to what's going on. But yeah, every now and then you'll get people like this guy asking about the weather that has nothing to do with it there. I honestly think that guy asking the question about the weather was more about them not having a question to ask, because that'll happen too. If you have an inexperienced media member, maybe you have 10 questions in your head, and someone, like by the time it gets to be your turn to get the microphone, maybe someone's asked all your questions and you've already volunteered to ask a question. So you're kind of running out of ideas. That's what it looked like to me. I've also had it where media members will forget the question. It happens, right? So these are things that sort of slip through the cracks, but that's because the UFC is relying that if you work for a big outlet, you're probably legit when it comes to asking questions. But every now and then you get dumb questions sort of seeping in, and that's sort of where things go. And one thing I'll say as well to kind of defend some media members, and I think the fans need to kind of take notice, like some stuff is just, people are going to make mistakes. You know what I mean? Like I've made mistakes in press conferences before when asking questions. Sometimes you forget about, you know, certain little details. And one of the things I'll also mention is that if you're covering a UFC card that's out east, so like we just had Miami for UFC 299, we had Toronto in January for UFC 297. I'll use that as an example. That press conference finished at like 3:30 in the morning, 3 in the morning. So you're tired. You're gonna make mistakes if you're super tired. I mean, it does happen, right? I mean, this thing I think was a pre-fight interview, so that's even worse. But I do cut the media some slack as well, where, you know, I think the fans need to realize you're up pretty late covering an event. You know, you can have all the coffee in the world, but sometimes you're just very tired. Like that UFC 297 press conference I just referenced, I basically did the press conference and had to go straight to the airport. Like I didn't even have time to go back and grab my stuff. I had to bring my stuff with me because I knew the press conference was going to go late. So sort of on the defending side of the media, you're going to get some bad questions usually at the late press conferences, but yeah, anything pre-fight, that's fair game, and that deserves to be called out. So that's another thing to sort of keep in mind. And you don't really see bad questions being asked by the regulars. And you know who I'm talking about, you know, journalists from MMA Fighting or MMA Junkie or you know, Mac Life. They're all asking pretty good questions because they're veterans. If they ask something dumb, they have to go cover the next event, and people are going to be upset by that. If they continue to ask bad questions, then that's going to be a problem. But that's typically why you don't see media members that go to most of the events, the regulars, you don't see them ask really bad questions because they're used to it. They know what to ask, but it also depends on the city. Like I said, like you could go to, like, for example, let's talk about Miami, the last pay-per-view, UFC 299. You probably had a bunch of, you know, big outlets that are from Miami that got approved because they're local, but not necessarily UFC fans. You might have had a question or two that wasn't very good. And that's just because they're local media. They're not necessarily, you know, major media or, you know, media that covers every single UFC event. That happens too. And another thing that annoys me, and you get this every now and then, is people always asking about the city. What do you think of the city? All this stuff. Like that's because they're local media. They have to ask those type of questions. So that's another thing to sort of keep in mind. So yeah, that I hopefully that gives you a better understanding as to why every now and then you will get people asking bad questions. It's because typically in a lot of cases, they're not either experienced or they're not big MMA fans. And that's why you get those questions there as well. So I don't know what you guys think in the comment section below. Does this kind of clear things up a little bit? And I'll mention it as well. I'm not an expert. I've asked some bad questions too. This isn't about looking down on other media members. And that's certainly not the point of this video. It's more so to give fans an understanding of how the industry works. And like I said, I've covered enough events where every now and then you will see a really bad question or a dumb question. You'll roll your eyes, but that's why, again, The UFC bases their credential system a little bit different than other promotions, and that's why sometimes you'll have these journalists slip through the cracks. Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, @Lynch on Sports. If there's any other video ideas you want me to do related to the media, I would love to hear from you, because I always like making videos like this. It's a lot of fun. Make sure you hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell. I'm James Lynch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.